Hello, I'm Bart, and I'm a traumatic brain injury survivor. My TBI, or my traumatic brain injury, was a result from a car accident when I was 16. I just turned 34. My brain injury was so severe that doctors believed I should remain in an institution. But instead, my parents brought me home. They tried alternative therapies like hyperbaric oxygen, and I began slowly to improve. So thank you very much, Joe and Dale. Today, I live in my own apartment in Delmar, New York, work part-time at Swifty's Restaurant and Pub, and have made new friends and have moved on. So if you stop by, just make sure you ask if Bart's there and stuff like that, but I really doubt that any of you will, but still. Sorry. My dad wrote a book about my recovery called No Stone Unturned. It's in college libraries all over the world, including dozens in Florida. So if you wouldn't mind just looking up and stop by the library. Recently, our family started a foundation to advocate for alternative therapies for brain injury survivors. It's called the Brain Alternative Rehabilitation Therapy Foundation, or the BART Foundation. The name is strictly a coincidence. Even though I have my suspicions that you were the person that gave the little, hope you have time Hope you have time to check out our website, www.thebartfoundation.org, and find our work for some use. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this presentation, and here's my dad, Mr. Goldstein.
Thanks, everyone. I must say, being introduced by Bart and David, two of my heroes. It's great to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for coming. Let me just ask a couple of questions, then we'll get started. Who here has had a traumatic or some other kind of acquired brain injury? Oh, we've got a couple. Thank you for coming. You're most on it, yes. And I hope you find the presentation really useful, not just interesting and fun, but useful. How about anyone who has an acquired brain injury survivor in their family or loved one? Okay, that's me too. Great. Yeah. And then who's a professional who is involved in serving this community? Okay, well, welcome all of you. And the rest of you have curiosity, which is great. So, I'd like to try to focus on answering a specific question about alternative therapies. Namely, if alternative therapies are so darn good, why are they still alternatives? Why are they outside the tent? Why are they not more widely embraced? I'd like to examine that question and then talk about how we might vet safe alternatives, and finally discuss a couple of specific alternatives in detail. Before I do that, I want to give you a sense of, Bart said that the hospital and the school district both recommended institutionalization. This is 9 months post-injury. I want to give you a sense that that was not an arbitrary judgment, or they weren't just being mean-spirited. Give you a sense of where he was at. And I want you to imagine, not so much Bart, because you don't know Bart, but imagine your own son or daughter, or niece or nephew, or the boy or girl next door. 9 months in, he is still learning to walk. He's trying to learn to use his right hand. He's right side dominant. He speaks, but it's very mumbled. It's sort of like what you would imagine a zombie might sound like if it was speaking. He had been elected class clown in middle school. Maybe he hasn't lost his touch. And yet he doesn't understand even a simple joke or an expression. If you say, hey, you got out of bed on the wrong side, which he frequently did, he just looked at you like he didn't understand. He'd been in advanced, accelerated math class, and he is struggling to relearn the times tables. He'd been a point guard for the high school, but he really can't dribble or manage to reach the hoop. He seems to be in a fog, too exhausted to even carry on the struggle. Now, as if all that isn't bad enough, at that time, inappropriate behaviors began to emerge. Wild, angry outbursts calculated perfectly to drive away friends and drive family nuts. Dale and I disagreed with the officials and the bureaucrats, and we brought him home, and we thought he'd have a better chance of regaining his life at home and back in school. All of us, and our daughter's not here today, we have a younger daughter, Cassidy, all of us mourned the boy lost in the crash, even as we struggled to deal with the stranger in our midst. We're each of us walking wounded in our own way. I'm not complaining, I'm just pointing out that when an injury like this occurs, the whole family is swept up in it. The central lesson of our experience in our book and our foundation, the BART Foundation, is that for survivors of severe TBI or other acquired brain injuries, alternative therapies are not merely a good option. Frequently, they are a necessity. Best practices of conventional medicine only take us so far, often, as in Bart's case, to the nursing home door. Or if home, then heavily medicated, facing long empty hours and overwhelming family resources. For us, alternatives made all the difference. So that's our starting place, that there are conditions for which conventional medicine cannot give one a satisfactory outcome. ABI, you can make your own list, you're all familiar with ALS, or Huntington's disease, and so on, even Lyme disease. So we start from that. I should say we're going to take a look at alternatives, which made all the difference for us. And our story is merely an anecdote, it's not even a case study, but it's an interesting one, and it's led to other things. There are no guarantees, so we threw ourselves into alternatives. I'm going to talk about alternatives. What we need to bear in mind is what I often refer to as Socratic humility. Socratic humility. You know, Socrates, he got into a lot of trouble by saying to so-called wise people that it seems that I'm wiser than them to this small degree, that I do not think I know what I do not know. I do not think I know what I do not know. So we start with a frank admission of our own ignorance and an awareness that people who think they know may not know. So why are doctors, physicians, and medical professionals so reluctant to try alternatives? Well, at the most base level, they stick with what they're familiar with, what they learned in school and in their practice, and all of us do very much the same. Who wouldn't do the same? So they have no training in alternatives whatsoever. And almost by definition, because we define an alternative therapy as outside of mainstream practice and not covered by insurance, which they usually go together. Physicians are very busy. They're busy at all times in their career, in school and afterwards. And they're taught to kind of stay on the straight and narrow. They don't go off course. I'll just read this one sentence for the docs here. Before eventually winning universal acceptance, the practices of conducting heart surgery or of treating peptic ulcers as infections were doggedly opposed and bitterly denounced by the medical establishment. I'm not here to pillory the docs. Our board is filled with blue ribbon docs, and we love our docs, but we recognize that they need Socratic humility as well. So what doctors, physicians do is they take a handy benchmark, a useful device, and they take FDA approval as their standard of what they should be looking at, and alternatives are outside of that. So they don't go there at all. To be fair, there are some serious risks involved in using alternative therapies for the physicians. Forget about the patients. We'll talk about that later. The physicians may find that they have malpractice lawsuits, since this is outside of standard practice. They may even be disciplined by local medical boards for using unapproved practices. And in extreme cases, they may actually lose their license or face criminal charges. It's happened from the FDA or others. I've had docs time and again write me saying, email, I'm tempted to try hyperbaric oxygen, but I'm concerned about the practical consequences for my practice. So it falls to us, to the rest of us, who really bear the cost of inaction. It falls to the rest of us, caregivers, adjunctive health professionals, to stay humble, to keep an open mind, and cautiously explore what really is the unknown. When we went into alternative therapies, we understood that we didn't know. So the question is, if scientific proof and complete understanding is the gold bar in medicine, and it is, what should we do about alternative therapies, thank you, son, with proven records of safety and a good bit of evidence supporting them? Not FDA approved, but proven records of safety and some good evidence. You could wait and do nothing. In fact, Jean-Paul Sartre said that to do nothing is to make a decision. You may be able to tell I was a philo major, right? It didn't do me any good, but it didn't do me any harm either. Okay? So at the BART Foundation, we hope you'll take a look, not just through the foundation, you can do the same methodology yourself, basically. We advocate a Socratic, pragmatic approach. The Socratic part is we recognize that we're basically ignorant, makes us have an open mind, and we take a pragmatic approach. The first principle is the Hippocratic test, right? Hippocrates, do no harm. That's the first one. Any reasonable and prudent person would insist on that. And I have to say here, it does not suffice to go by intuition or common sense. We still need the medical professionals. We still need their opinion of the safety of an alternative therapy. Not its effectiveness, because they don't know about its effectiveness any more than they know about the dust on the far side of the moon. So in the early years when the decision was made, could we bring BART back into the community, Dale and I cobbled together a board of medical professionals. Now, mind you, the board didn't know they served on a board or even that there was a board. But when we came up with a useful alternative therapy, we would call and say, hey, doc, what do you think? We want to try hyperbaric oxygen for BART. Can it do any harm? And we only proceeded when we got a clear slate, when everyone agreed it would do no harm. Generally, the physicians also rendered an opinion and said it would be harmless but also useless. But here we had a real advantage. We knew we were ignorant. Okay. Once safety can be assured, once you've gone through this process, and you can do it yourself, you don't have to come to the BART Foundation for that, although you're very welcome to. Further vetting has to be done. You have to see what is the evidence in favor of this particular alternative. The background process involves a good bit of research of the medical literature. I practically live at PubMed. That's not Club Med, I wish it were. PubMed, the NIH database, all right? And then you have to speak to people, to users of the therapy, to manufacturers, and hope that you might get lucky. There are no guarantees. There's no credible assurance of success, even after all of this. Okay. Eventually, we tried several alternative therapies, as I defined, and some were useless rather. But others, like hyperbaric oxygen therapy, craniosacral therapy, neurofeedback, and several versions of that, and nutraceutical supplementation, especially omega-3 fish oils. They were remarkably successful, and they gradually transformed Bart's life. And if you don't believe me, you talk to him afterwards. Okay, he'll convince you. If you want the granular details, you can read the book. It's in a library near you. I can almost guarantee it. And it's available.
What's the title of the book?
It's called No Stone Unturned. I owe that to my wife. I owe the whole book to my wife because she kept a journal. I got you covered. Anyway, despite everything I've said, it is still by far the consensus among physicians that, say, hyperbaric oxygen, which I've mentioned and I'm going to spend some time on, is not evidence-based. We maybe got lucky, but it's just an anecdote. It's an old wives' tale. And what they mean by that fundamentally is that it's not FDA approved for acquired brain injuries. And if you push them a little more and you drill down a little more, they might point out that there are, in fact, no double-blind placebo studies indicating that HBOT or hyperbaric oxygen is effective. Let me assume you know what a placebo study is. And a placebo is something that has no therapeutic effect. I want to look at HBOT because we had the best luck with BART, but it also has by far the most scientific evidence supporting it, and deserves our attention. Now, how HBOT works, hyperbaric oxygen, is only partially understood. The same could be said for all these alternative therapies, and for that matter, for all the mainstream therapies. If you've seen movies about divers, you may have seen they go into a chamber to prevent the bends. That's fundamentally what's going on. And what happens is the patient is placed in the chamber, which is then pressurized to about 1.5 atmospheres, equivalent to about 16 feet of depth in the water, and then is given pure oxygen. Now, the air we breathe is approximately 21% oxygen, but this is pure oxygen, and it's under heavy pressure. And the upshot is that it overwhelms the normal ways, through the alveoli, and we won't go into that, the normal ways of getting oxygen into the blood. And instead, the blood ends up being supersaturated with oxygen, up to 15 times as much as normally would be present. That's a lot. 15 times as much. The main effect that's been demonstrated, there's many studies, so this part is not controversial. The main effect of hyperbaric oxygen is that it leads to revascularization, meaning the regrowth of the tiny arterioles and veins in the injured area. This process is sometimes referred to as angiogenesis. And that blood supply does the real work of healing, whether it's a third-degree burn or a brain injury. It brings in the oxygen, the needed nutrients, it removes the toxins. Ironically, if you are a wounded veteran, or even not a wounded veteran, just a veteran with a stubborn diabetic ulcer on your big toe, you could get hyperbaric oxygen in any major medical center. But if you went there with a traumatic brain injury, no, you just plumb out of luck. Hyperbaric oxygen is approved for 14 conditions here in the States, but brain injury is not one of them. And you might say, why not just resolve this with a placebo trial? And you'll have to take my word on this, but I will give you a citation. It's a wonderful article. It's called, "Is the Time Right for Alternatives?" Is the Time Right for Alternatives? In Brainline magazine. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, C. Dale, she has additional resources on all of these therapies and also on the BART Foundation. Okay, well, in that article, which I wrote, it digs down and it demonstrates why it's virtually impossible to create a placebo environment for hyperbaric oxygen. Or if you could do it, it would actually be injurious, and so it would be unethical. So what did the Israelis do? They're always looking to push the envelope. The Israelis did the next best thing. Not a placebo study, but a so-called crossover study. Two groups. One group gets the HBOT, the other group gets nothing. They get, as we used to say in the hood, they get ugats, right? They get nothing. Right? After 8 weeks, studies are done. SPECT scans are made of the brains before and after with both groups. And then the second group enjoys 8 weeks of HBOT. And what the Israelis found, right, and we find it here too, is that after 8 weeks of hyperbaric oxygen, the injured portion of the brain increased its blood profusion by an average of over 40%. Now that's a lot. Hold your hand and stop the blood, and then after a few minutes, let it go. Feel the blood coming back. Over 40%. By the way, those tests were done blind. So the lab technicians didn't know who'd had the HBOT and who was in the control group. As a result of this study, they concluded, and I want to read the conclusion, HBOT can induce neuroplasticity, leading to repair of chronically impaired brain functions and improve quality of life in mild traumatic brain injury patients with prolonged post-concussion syndrome at late chronic stage. I emphasize late chronic stage because the normal wisdom is after a year or two, there's nothing for it. As they said in the neighborhood, garnished helping, right? There's nothing you can do about it. They dealt with patients up to 5 years out, 5 years post-injury, and saw these dramatic results. And it wasn't just the blood perfusion. They had done cognitive and quality of life tests before, during, and after, and they were also very improved. As a result of these studies, beginning about 2012 or 2013, HBOT became part of the standard of treatment in Israel for most brain injuries. Naturally, they wanted to replicate the studies, so they did. They replicated the traumatic brain injury studies with stroke survivors, and then again with other anoxic brain injury survivors, all the same results, averaging 40% increased blood perfusion and improved subjective tests. Now I ask you, can it be that in Israel, HBOT is evidence-based, but not here? It would seem that it couldn't be unless we understand scientific base to be equivalent to FDA approval. But it's not, all right? You may still be sitting on the fence. You may say, well, what would a reasonable person do? I would say, hop a plane to Israel if a tragedy happens to you. But you might wait for more evidence, and there are 2 clinical trials here in the States, and we only pay attention to the States in the States. There's one by Dr. Paul Harch, currently underway in New Orleans. He is the dean of hyperbaric medicine. No one knows more than him. And there's a second one going on in Jupiter, Florida, Dr. Mishkin. How many, I gotta ask, besides Bart and I, are there any Jets fans here? Long suffering, let's hear it for us, long suffering. Well, the one in Jupiter, Florida has Joe Namath's name on it, and frankly, I spoke to him about it when he was setting up, so in a small way we contributed to that. And Bart went to the Namath football camp. Okay, so they'll be replicating the Israeli results. So you say, well, that settles that, but not so fast. I wish it fully settled. The VA had gone ahead, even before the Israelis, and done a couple of placebo tests, and they concluded that HBOT is mere placebo. However, the tests were completely flawed because they never really created a controlled environment. And as I say, read the article, or I'll take questions on it, I'm very familiar with it. But the study was, because it came out of the VA, it was very influential. In fact, the FDA went and issued a warning to physicians and patients against using HBOT for neurological conditions. So it set us back in this country for many years. And it shows we have to have eternal vigilance. We can't take even VA studies at their face value. Dr. George Wolfe, I want to read this briefly. He's the author. He's one of the 2 principal authors of that study. Well, after the Israelis, he had a little bit of change of mind. He studied his own data again, and he wrote this. There's a potential gain and no potential loss. The VA clinical practice guidelines define a B evidence rating as a recommendation that clinicians provide the service to eligible patients. at least fair evidence was found that the intervention improves health outcomes and concludes that benefits outweigh harm. So this is the nub of the matter. I'll finish up with HBOT. The nub of the matter is that it's FDA approved for 14 other uses. It's really quite safe. And in fact, compared to the medications prescribed for brain injury survivors, it's very safe. And it has virtually no side effects. Of course, nothing is 100% safe, not even aspirin, not even Tylenol. The mechanisms of healing are fairly well understood and seem to be the same regardless of the injury, whether it's a burn, a crushing wound, or a brain injury. So why not allow use off-label for brain injuries? After all, everything that a neurologist does for a brain injury survivor is off-label. It's all off-label. And if you talk to a doctor, and I have many times, they'll tell you that 40% of what they prescribe is off-label. So what would be the harm if it's safe and there's good evidence? The bar for physicians, we talked about that. That's FDA approval. And I should say, and I don't want to pillory the FDA too, I wouldn't want to eat all the lettuce that I do without them. But the process of pushing something through the FDA for approval costs tens of millions of dollars. And it is not going to happen for hyperbaric or any of the therapies I'm going to mention. You say never, it ain't happening, okay? But still, for those of us in the trenches, what is the reasonable and prudent course of action? Now, there are several other alternatives. I haven't got time to go into them. I'm going to mention them, so we can do it in the Q&A or after. These are all worthy of consideration. Many of them are FDA approved for other uses, so they'd have to be prescribed off-label. There's neurofeedback, craniosacral therapy, photobiomodulation, a horrible word. It means low-level light devices. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, the PONS device, and omega-3 fish oils. Some of the recurrent themes in all of these therapies is increased blood supply, lowered inflammation, and enhanced cellular function. Is everyone hearing me? I hope so. Okay, good. Okay, so we're not cheerleaders at the BART Foundation. We're not cheerleaders for just these therapies. Over time, more robust therapies will emerge, both conventional and unconventional. I'm sure when they write the history of our times, the medical history, and people read that we were using neurofeedback and craniosacral therapy to treat brain injury, they're going to laugh and say, well, at least they weren't using leeches or poultices, right? So, but right now, they're still tops. We got lucky. There's a fellow named Michael Lewis. He recently retired from the Army as a colonel. He's a doctor. And he wrote us. He apparently read the book and wrote me an email and said, you did a good job, fine job with BART, but you could do better. We are finding, this was in Iraq, that we can take people in permanent vegetative states and get them walking and more with massive doses of omega-3 fish oils. And that's the other therapy I want to talk about a little because it's inexpensive. Hyperbaric oxygen is the most expensive of these therapies, runs probably 20 grand to get what you need. And fish oils run a few $100s a year. I should say, if you go to the BART Foundation, you'll see right on our front page that we now have a scholarship for brain injury survivors to get the fish oils at cost from barley and soil. So Lewis eventually, we spoke by phone, and he's a physician, but he's a regular doctor. Or rather, a regular soldier, and he talks like a soldier. And he said to me, listen, think of the brain as a brick outhouse. He used a different word than out. And it gets blown up by an IED, and it's all over the place, and we start throwing in the fish oils loads of fresh bricks. And the bricks douse the inflammation and reduce the other catabolic things that are going on in the brain, and the brain in its wisdom begins to rebuild itself. And he told me that, and I remember saying to him, honestly, this sounds like an old wives' tale. I mean, it doesn't sound like science at all. And I loved him when he said this, and we've become friends since. He said, well, Joe, we don't know much about the brain. Everything that we think we know is more or less like an old wives' tale. Socratic humility. So let's dive a little deeper into omega-3. I want to talk about where Bart was at. This was 13 years post-injury. So 13 years post-injury, you're not expecting any real improvement. All right, the doctors will tell you that. You've done what you could, more or less. He had early on lost the use of his right hand, or most of it. He'd been rated at about 15% use of his right hand by the occupational therapists. And of course, he adjusted, he adapted. He learned to do things with his right hand, to eat, to write. It was not a thing of beauty, believe me. Try eating with the wrong hand. But he managed to adapt. We were convinced of the safety of the therapy, so I took Lewis's lead and we started to give Bart massive doses of omega-3, enough to float a boat, literally. It was 15 grams. It titrated down. And you can get that at our foundation, all those protocols. Anyway, Mother's Day rolls around, about 3 months after he started using the fish oils. We go out to a Chinese restaurant. I'm Jewish, so it's going to be Chinese for special events. And Bart says to his mother, he says, look, Mom, watch this. He picks up chopsticks with his right hand, and he proceeds to eat the whole meal, right, from 15% usage. And he then went on to start writing with his right hand. He plays the guitar again with his right hand. He is right side dominant after a 13-year hiatus. Before it goes to his head, he's not perfect, but he went from, I'm guesstimating, 15% to about 60 or 65%. And who among us is perfect? There is hardly any, I couldn't find in PubMed or anywhere else, any precedent for this sort of recovery. Now, Lewis, when I reported it to him, he explained that he developed the protocol for omega-3 administration originally through feeding tubes, and then eventually for oral doses, because they were able to save the lives of the soldiers in the MASH units because of improved emergency treatments, but then they basically had to warehouse them. They couldn't bring them back. And he found that this therapy began to do just that, to bring them back. Patients reported clearer thinking, improved energy, reduced irritability, less headaches, and improved sleep. Mind you, the FDA considers omega-3 safe. Up to 3,000 milligrams a day are considered grass. That's not the kind you smoke. Grass, generally regarded as safe. Okay? Although I should say, all of these therapies, if you're going to try them, try to work with a doctor. Yeah. Find somebody open-minded enough to at least say, well, it won't do any harm. Go ahead. Now, there is a good deal by now of preclinical and even a fair amount of clinical evidence of omega-3's effectiveness in helping brain injuries. There's also evidence, I know this is how I heard of it, that it lowers blood pressure, lowers triglyceride levels, manages heart disease, fends off Alzheimer's, controls ADHD, and reduces depression. It's good for lots of things. And according to Lewis, who is actively investigating, probably many other inflammatory conditions like lupus and so on. There was a recent study, a massive longitudinal study of elderly women that showed those of them that had consumed more or that had high levels of DHA and EPA in their blood were 20% less likely to die. That's a 20% lowering of mortality. Means you won't get hit by a bus if you're taking this stuff. Okay? Not many other supplements can make similar claims. And I want to emphasize this in terms of scientific evidence, 3 respected peer groups of scientists, of physicians, have in the last few years endorsed its use for the acute stage of brain injuries. Okay? The American Society for Parental and Enteral Nutrition, that's intravenous and feeding tube, their European equivalent, and also the Society for Critical Care Medicine. In 2016, 17, and 18, they all recommend omega-3 supplementation through feeding tubes for critically ill TBI patients. That's based on the supporting evidence. I should say, you'd say, well, that settles that, just like in the other case. Not quite. Most doctors do not generally read or follow these guidelines. But we can hope to educate them. We can hope to educate them and bring them around. Some of the other therapies I discussed have even more scientific evidence than the fish oils, but they are much more expensive and logistically difficult. I wish it were the case that when you consider alternative therapies, that we find ourselves suddenly out of the woods.